Hi everyone, welcome back to Civil War Monitors Behind the Lines. I'm your host, David Thompson. Today I'm joined by Dr. Anne Sarah Rubin, who is an Associate Professor of History at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and the recent author of Through the Heart of Dixie, Sherman's March and American Memory, which is now out with the University of North Carolina Press. So Dr. Rubin, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure.
Now this is not your traditional look at Sherman's March, and I think how we define Sherman's March is something very interesting in terms of how you tackle it in the book, and perhaps it's something that we'll discuss in more detail. But how does this book really deviate from other studies of the March?
I mean, the biggest deviation is that it's about the way that Americans have remembered, or I sort of move away from the language of memory in favor of the language of storytelling, so the kinds of stories that people have told about the March in the years afterwards. So my first chapter gives you a broad overview of the March, but it's nowhere near as detailed as so many other studies of the March have been. And what I really do then is start to unpack the stories that people tell and the different perspectives that people bring to the stories of the March.
Right, and you unpack that you dedicate a chapter each to Southern white civilians, and then there's another chapter on African Americans, and finally another on Union soldiers. So I wondered if you might be able to kind of walk us through those three chapters, just kind of what they're addressing, and maybe if you've got a favorite story that you'd like to share from one or all, by all means, feel free to go ahead.
I think that the chapter that may seem the most familiar to people, or the stories that will seem the most familiar, are probably those of Southern civilians, because they tell the kind of conventional stories of Sherman's March, of soldiers coming in, of mass confusion and terror, and Sherman's men destroying things and stealing and all of that. And I do have a lot of those kinds of stories because, frankly, there are a lot of those stories. But the ones that I think are more interesting, or there's a twist on a lot of these stories, too, so that I start to unpack stories that are they're stories of victimization, which I think white Southerners use to kind of hold on to anger from after the war. And then there's stories of what I call kind of salvation stories, where these are the stories of, okay, well, our house was spared. Why was it spared? Was it spared because Sherman had been in love with a girl who lived in the house at one point? Was it spared because we hung the Masonic apron on the door, and that protected the house because the soldiers who came through were Masons? And then there are also stories that I look at where they're really more of a twist of how do you outwit the Yankees, right? How do you hide something so the Yankees can't find it? Do you stick a wallet in a baby's diaper? Because, no man's going in there, right? Do you, run to the door and yell smallpox, smallpox, so the soldiers won't even come in? And I mean, if I had to pick a favorite one of those stories, it's actually a pretty well-known one, but that in Milledgeville, Georgia, most of the government, the Georgia state government, fled, and they took a lot with them. They actually loaded up train cars of official papers and things like that. But they left behind the Great Seal and the one book of legislative acts that hadn't gotten their official signatures yet. And the Secretary of State, Nathan Barnett, and his wife actually took these two items. The wife and their sons bricked the seal up in a pillar, and then she wrapped the legislative acts book up in an oilskin, an oilcloth, and buried it in her pig pen. And the idea was to keep this from Sherman's men, which in fact turned out to be pretty prescient, because when Sherman soldiers came into Milledgeville, they actually had a mock legislative session in the Georgia House, in the chamber where they repealed Georgia's session. So the thinking was, let's hide this Great Seal and keep it from being made official. So I try to unpack these different kinds of stories and see, well, why would people tell one story or another story? How do you explain it? When it comes to African Americans, I think these are also stories that are less familiar, that we see a real dichotomy there, that on the one hand, Sherman's army is the greatest army of liberation during the war. And if you've ever looked at Scott Nesbitt's Visualizing Emancipation, it's really fantastic. You really can follow Sherman's March by the light of these emancipation events. On the other hand, Sherman soldiers are not necessarily comfortable with this role as emancipators. Most of them are not abolitionists at heart. Most of them, this is a sort of incidental finding. And Sherman is this way. Sherman did not really feel any great sympathy for African Americans. He did not want African American troops in his army. And so African Americans really are mistreated a lot along the lines of the march. They're left hungry, they're assaulted. So it's these kind of complicated stories that it's not one thing or another, it's both. It's multiple narratives at multiple times. And then the third group are the veterans. And again, I think this is a less familiar story, which is that Sherman's veterans, we're all very familiar with the Grand Army of the Republic. They mostly were members of the Society of the Army of the Tennessee. And at their annual reunions, which they held well into the 20th century, they would get together and make speeches. A lot of them also were members of the Military Order of the Loyal Legion of the United States. And again, speeches and dinners. And the stories that they tell about the march and the way that they make sense of their experiences on the march are, they thought it was great. They feel completely unabashed about what they did. They loved it, right? They're not marching very far. There's so much food to eat, so much variety of food that they'd never had before. And no one is shooting at them most of the time. And they feel like they won the war, that their march won the war. And so they take this great pride in the march that I think we're not always comfortable with.
Now, as you move further into the book, Chapter 5, especially here, deals with Sherman the man, quote unquote, and you're actually tackling William Tecumseh Sherman and how perceptions of Sherman change over the years following this march, which we probably should, have mentioned from the get-go. We're in the midst of the sesquicentennial of it.
Right.
And I'm sure we'll come back to that towards the end of our conversation here, but we are right in the midst of the 150th. So following this actual event here in 1864, moving into 1865, we count the Carolinas, how does perceptions of Sherman change?
I think Sherman's really, again, I mean, if you think there are a lot of books written about Sherman's March, there's a lot of biographies of Sherman also. I don't really do a biography of Sherman. What I do is look at his image and how, first of all, he really shapes his image in his memoirs, which were published in the 1870s, where, again, he's very upfront about what he was doing with the march, and he's very upfront about the fact that he's using it as a form of psychological warfare. He talks about blaming the burning of Columbia on Wade Hampton, and he hedges, right? I mean, I'm pretty sure it was Wade Hampton, but even if it wasn't Wade Hampton, it made everybody so upset and angry that it was completely worth it to blame it on Wade Hampton, which he gets in trouble for. Lots of people come after him for that, especially actually Jefferson Davis. What's interesting about Sherman is that after the war, he doesn't support black equality. He doesn't support African American suffrage. He's out west, frankly, exterminating Indians. And so because of that, he's seen as somebody who's relatively sympathetic to white Southerners in the 1870s and a little less so maybe in the 1880s. He comes back to Atlanta in 1879 as part of a tour of the South that he's taking as General-in-Chief of the Army, and he's welcomed with open arms. I mean, there's jokes in the newspaper and such, hide the matches, Sherman's coming. But he's welcomed very warmly. He feels very warmly towards Atlanta and Atlantans. He comes back again in 1881 for the International Cotton States Exposition. And he's welcomed maybe slightly less warmly. I think it's a little bit hair-splitting. But what happens to him over time, I think, is that as people increase in distance from the march, they start to see the march as more destructive, more violent than it was. And so Sherman becomes, I think, a kind of scapegoat for not just the violence and destructiveness of the march, but for generations of violence and destructiveness and war against civilians, right? This notion that Sherman is somehow the father of total war, that you can draw a line that connects Sherman to World War I, to the Vietnam War, to today, is I mean, it's kind of preposterous, actually, because Sherman's idea of total war is a war that doesn't involve the killing of civilians. It's a war against property, and that's not to be minimized, but it's a very different kind of war than the wars we see in the 20th and 21st century that feature things like ethnic cleansing. Sherman and his men were not doing any of that. And there's been, I think, a bit of a rehabilitation, really just recently, of Sherman, or a recognition, I think, of the more subtle interpretation of who Sherman was.
Now, beyond talking about Sherman in the book, we move into some really interesting areas after this point in terms of, Sherman's March and popular culture, really. Mm-hmm. So looking at how Sherman's March is depicted by travel writers, how it's predicted in film, how poets depict it. You name it, it's something that gets addressed. I found the vignette at the beginning when you mentioned the Calgary Flames as kind of an old vestige of the Atlanta Flames, a former NHL team that moves to Calgary. It's fantastic. So the legacy of Sherman lives on. So I wondered if you could just touch on some of these probably lesser known areas, probably, Save Gone with the Wind. That's something I'm sure people are very familiar with, but there are other things that people are going to be far less familiar with the connections to Sherman's March.
Yeah, it does have a really powerful cultural legacy. I'm glad you liked that hockey opening. My husband was really pushing for that. So he was very pleased that I included that. I think the cultural importance, I can't believe you're not letting me talk about Gone with the Wind, because
I'm sorry. Feel free to talk about it.
I'll talk about it in a minute, but I mean, it does sort of blot out the sun, but in terms of talking about Sherman and culture. But I think one thing that people are not maybe as well aware of is George Barnard's photographic views of Sherman's campaign. George Barnard was a photographer who actually was on Sherman's March for the first part of it. And what happened is he took a lot of photographs of the Atlanta campaign, so coming down from Chattanooga to Atlanta, a lot of photographs of the ruins of Atlanta. He doesn't take any photographs along the route of the march itself, although he does do some sketches and drawings that he sends back to Harper's Weekly. Then he does some photography in Savannah. Then he splits off from Sherman. But then in 1866, Barnard decides he wants to publish a book of these photographs, and he goes back. So he photographs the ruins in Columbia and a couple of other places. But then it's really interesting, and in Barnard's book, In Photographic Views, which I was really fortunate in that UMBC actually has a copy of it. So I got to see the originals, but there are a couple of online versions of it that are very good. What's really interesting is that then they add things in that Sherman doesn't even have a part of. So there's a bunch of photographs of ruins in Charleston, and even a building in Charleston that burned in 1861. But Barnard includes it, and he never says in the caption, Sherman burned this, but the clear implication is that he does. And so I think that's a really interesting way that it adds to, it sort of burnishes the legend of Sherman as destroyer. So I love Barnard for that. I think he's just really interesting. Herman Melville wrote 2 poems about Sherman's March. One very much in the sort of heroic vein, very much a lot like the song Marching Through Georgia, which is well known. But what's more interesting to me, I think, is the second poem that Melville wrote, and they're one after the other in his collection of Civil War poetry, where he writes, instead he flips it, and he writes it from the perspective of white Southerners. It's called The Frenzy in the Wake. And so I think what's interesting about that is that Melville's kind of playing with these two sides of Sherman's March. Lots and lots of novels, most of them not very good. It was very much like, the old romance of reunion, right? The headstrong and beautiful Southern girl and the honorable and noble Union officer, and you think they'll never, ever fall in love, and yet every time they do. So there's a lot of that. There's lots of songs about Sherman's March, obviously Marching Through Georgia, which hilariously people used to play all the time for Jimmy Carter until he kind of snapped. And in fact, he had gotten in a bunch of fights. Carter had gotten into a bunch of fights when he was a plebe at the Naval Academy because people kept trying to make him sing Marching Through Georgia, which I thought was really interesting. And then even going up to, there was this 1970s kind of concept country album about the Civil War called White Mansions that I'm not very familiar with country music, but Waylon Jennings was part of this group that put it together, and they had a song about Sherman's March in it. So it really does kind of permeate the culture. Now can I talk about Gone with the Wind?
Oh, please do.
I have to talk about Gone with the Wind because it really does, I think, shape how people from the 1930s on understand Sherman's March. And the novel and the film do so in different ways. I mean, I think in the novel, Margaret Mitchell's really, really thorough and really, really careful about all the Civil War research that she did. Because she said afterwards, she said, I don't want anybody coming through and correcting me and saying, I put a unit in the wrong place. And when I reread the book, which I had read it as a teenager, and then I reread the book a couple of years ago working on this book, and I was really struck by first of all, how rich it is, how rich the Civil War parts are, how well she describes a lot of the campaigns for Atlanta. Then I got to the Reconstruction sections of it, and I thought, oh, right, this is why Gone with the Wind is so problematic, because it's like it's straight out of the Dunning School. But the way that she frames Sherman as, this kind of juggernaut and this horde, and especially the way that a lot of it is filmed by David O. Selznick, really cements this image of Sherman as the epitome of all evil in the minds of Americans. And it's fascinating because he's never on screen. You never see him. I mean, you hardly see, you see a couple of Union soldiers, and the assumption is they're out of Sherman's army, but it's shaky. And yet he comes to be this great villain of the first half of the movie. So I think that's why it's so important, as problematic as it is.
And now finally, there's a digital component to this that accompanies the book. And I wondered, because that's something that's very active at the moment and it's continuing to be developed. So I wondered if you wanted to just take a little bit of time to plug that.
Sure. I had done digital projects starting in graduate school. I had worked on the Valley of the Shadow project with Ed Ayers. And I knew when I started this Sherman project that I wanted it to have a digital component. And I also knew I didn't want it to just be an archive, that I had built archives before. I wanted to see, because this was really evolving into a project about stories and storytelling and competing narratives, I wanted to see if there was a way to do that online, to make that kind of, a lot of what historians do, right? Weighing the evidence, telling different stories, see if you could make that visible online. I was really fortunate in that UMBC has a place called the Imaging Research Center where they build all kinds of fabulous digital projects. It's actually a part of the visual arts department. And they put me in touch with a woman named Kelly Bell, who's a professor of visual arts. And Kelly and I started working together on building this project that we call Mapping Memory, which is at shermansmarch.org. And what it is there's 5 different maps of Sherman's March, and each one represents a different point of view. So we have one from the perspective, we have one that we call the Sherman map, which is the sort of general overview. Then we have one that's specifically from the perspective of civilians. We have one from the perspective of soldiers, one about travel accounts and tourism. And then finally, one that engages with all of these cultural representations, fiction, music, things like that, poetry. And on all of them, you can trace the march through Georgia. The book covers the entire march up through the Carolinas. The digital project is just Georgia. You can trace the march through Georgia with a slider, so you can see where the march is every day. And there are little pins dropped. And if you click on a pin, for about 20 of these pins, you get a mini documentary, sort of a 3-minute animation or video about telling a story of this place from in all different visual styles, from all different perspectives. And then the rest of them, you just get a couple of screens and an image telling you the story of this place. And the idea is you can see, okay, well, how does Milledgeville look from the perspective of a soldier versus the perspective of civilians? So that is, 80% or so done. I'm still, every day I'm filling in more of these little screens, and Kelly's finishing the movies. The other piece of it that we're doing right now, or that I'm doing right now, is a day-by-day blog of Sherman's March. I started on the 15th. It's going to run up through the end of May, up until Sherman's Men march in the Grand Review of the Union Army on May 24th. And every day, it's just a couple of paragraphs from a different primary source. So trying, again, to get at the multiplicity of voices and experiences in Sherman's March. So sometimes it's an official dispatch. Sometimes it's from a woman's diary. Sometimes it's from a soldier's diary or Sherman's memoirs. Today's actually is a newspaper article from a Savannah newspaper talking about the Battle of Waynesboro, Georgia. So again, and every day you get something new.
Well, fair enough. Well, we know what you'll be doing at least through late May.
Exactly.
But what is on tap following that? What's the next project?
You know, I'm in a really unfamiliar position, which is I don't have a solid next project. I started thinking about this Sherman project right around the time that I was finishing my dissertation. I mean, when I went on the job market, this was my second project. And unlike a lot of people, I actually did my second project. I'm playing around right now with doing something maybe about vice and crime in the Civil War armies. I might do something about Civil War Baltimore, partly because I teach, because I teach in Baltimore. And I'm teaching a class this spring in conjunction with people from our video game design track, where we're going to build a small educational game about Civil War Baltimore and then test that out in my classes. So that may grow. It's an unfamiliar position for me, and I'm not someone who usually feels very good without a plan. So I keep trying to tell myself, don't panic, something will come up, I'm sure.
Well, it lends itself to a lot of flexibility. So I think
exactly.
That's probably the best way to look at it. I think it's safe to say a lot of historians, I think there's obviously two camps. There are those that can kind of do whatever and just kind of roam freely, and then there are those where structure is kind of the sine qua non, Yeah,
I want something where I'm back dealing more with letters and diaries. I sort of specifically chose this Sherman project because it was a lot of published sources. I live near Washington, D.C. I did probably 80% of my research either through interlibrary loan or at the Library of Congress, which was great for me. I had young kids, and so I couldn't travel a lot. But I do miss kind of reading through actual archival materials. So I know I want to get back to that. So at least there's that.
Oh, the archives are calling. They always call.
That's right.
Well, Dr. Rubin, thank you so much for taking some time to chat with us today. Again, the book is Through the Heart of Dixie, Sherman's March and American Memory, which is out with UNC Press. Certainly would advise everyone to pick it up just in time for the holidays here. You can read along with it in the midst here of the sesquicentennial of the March, but it is very much a different take on the event in terms of looking at the stories, as you say, following the actual march. This is not just the nitty-gritty details of the actual march, which are important, but we're moving beyond that and getting into a fairly complex story and one that needs to be told and is told here quite well. So, Dr. Rubin, thanks so much for being on again, and we'll hopefully talk to you again soon.
Thank you. Great to see you.